Hello everyone and welcome to the third and final Brodie's Energy Academy session of our autumn series. My name is Sonia Love and I'm a partner in the oil and gas team at Brodie's. Today we'll be looking at COP26, what happens now. So let's get started. First of all, today we've got Keith Patterson speaking, and Keith is a partner in our renewable energies team. Keith advises clients on the build out of new renewable energy projects, including wind farms, solar parks, biomass projects, and hydro schemes. Keith also advises on the sale and purchase of ready to build and operating projects, as well as setting up joint ventures to implement renewables projects. He advises developers and lenders, as well as purchasers and sellers. Next speaking, we have Isabella Van Green, who's a senior solicitor in our renewables team. She's experienced in the delivery of major energy projects, including energy from waste, offshore wind and conventional power. She acts for developers, contractors, investors, lenders in the public sector. And finally, speaking today, we have Sarah-Jane McArthur, who is also a partner in our renewable energies team. She's a versatile lawyer with experience in major project delivery across several sectors, including energy, waste, transport, water, education and health. She acts for the public sector, developers, contractors, investors and lenders. Her focus in the energy sector is on renewables, where she has supported developers, sponsors and banks on wind farms, both onshore and offshore, hydroelectricity, solar, bioenergy and tidal projects. Additionally, she has supported the development of a large number of district heating projects. So today we're going to be discussing COP26, the emerging policy framework and its implications, focusing on the energy sector. So over to you, Keith. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonia. So just before getting into COP, I was just going to go back to a couple of basics. First of all, that's, as you can see, that's our planet, of which there are trillions in the universe, but crucially, only one that we know of is livable. We also hear a lot about 1.5, 2 degrees, and I think quite a few people wonder, does that really make much of a difference? And I think it's useful to bear in mind that the baseline average temperature of the world is 14 degrees. It's now up at 15, but it is 14. So in that context, 1, 2 or 3 degrees is quite a big relative change to that baseline temperature. And if we look at the two graphs on the right, the top graph suggests or shows that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has continued on an upward trajectory, pretty much unchanged over the last 50, 60 years or so. And in particular, you can see since the Kyoto Protocol, which was in 1997, hasn't really made a huge amount of difference to that. But not only has that concentration been increasing, if you look at the graph below, what you see is that the amount of CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere increases every year. So each year we emit more than the year before. So before we can think about reducing it, we have to actually think about stopping increasing it. Next slide, please. So looking at the Glasgow, what became known as the Glasgow Climate Pact, or what's been named as the Glasgow Climate Pact. And it's useful to look back to Paris and what was supposed to happen. In the Paris Agreement, it was agreed that the 197 signatory countries to that would submit their NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, to 2030. Those NDCs would then convert the Paris target, which was a 1.5 target, into binding legal commitments. Those NDCs aggregated would result in a pathway to warming of 1.5 degrees. That was what was supposed to happen, and that was going to be built on two building blocks. Firstly, the rule book, which would talk about the measurement of CO2 and having uniform rules for that so that compliance could be assessed. And secondly, but not least, the provision of finance and $100 billion per year. Next slide, please. So what actually happened? So most countries, not all, but most countries did submit NDCs, and they are now legally binding commitments. However, you're probably not surprised to know that the temperature pathway implied by all of those NDCs once aggregated is not 1.5 degrees, but estimated at 2.4, and that's Climate Action Tracker have estimated that. That's not from the UN itself, but it shows a very considerable difference between the intended target and where the NDCs show we're heading. Interestingly, Climate Action Tracker also say that not a single NDC was fully compatible with the temperature pathway of 1.5 degrees. The UK was close, one of the closest, but not quite. I think it's also useful just to have a quick look at the agreement text in this. It doesn't refer to 1.5 and 2.4, but it refers to the targets. So the IPCC had recommended that to achieve 1.5, we needed to achieve carbon dioxide emissions reductions of 45% by 2030. The synthesis report, which is the UN's aggregation of all the NDCs, shows that it's not 45% reduction, but a 13.7% increase. So you can see that there's a considerable difference between what was asked for and what was actually produced. Next slide. So therefore, the way Paris was supposed to work was that it was assumed that those NDCs would remain in place through to 2030. If that happens, then 1.5, you've heard a lot about 1.5 being alive, remaining alive on life support, etc. This is the way in which they keep it alive, because otherwise we'd have got through to 2030 and we'd have already just about reached 1.5 by that point. So rather than be stuck with the insufficient NDCs, the Glasgow Climate Pact invites countries to upgrade their NDCs. And if you look at the text, you'll see I've picked out the relevant text. And when you're looking at that text, the italics are actually in the agreement itself. The bolded green are the positive bits, and the underlined grey text are the caveats, if you like. So there's a work programme being established, and in UN speak, that is essentially a UN programme being established that will basically challenge each country's NDCs and tell them where they can be improved. Oh, sorry, could we go back? Yep. 29 talks about the parties being requested. So this is not a mandatory, this is a request. And it's a request to all parties, not just those who are the laggards. So everybody is being requested. So that could well result in a few countries each looking at each other who's going to move first. We've heard a bit about people come back next year. And while there's going to be annual high-level ministerial meetings, actually the meeting that's going to result in change is the one in the United Arab Emirates in November 2023. So that is actually that's at least 2 years away now before these NDCs will be ratified in the new agreement. Next slide, please. So that's basically how Glasgow is going to try and fix the situation that has arisen. It was probably foreseeable. What were some of the arguments that were going on during the conference? Well, money, obviously. The $100 billion target wasn't reached, and you'll see that the agreement notes that with deep regret. It urges, which is a step up from requests, but it urges the developed country parties to deliver on that goal, and through to 2025, interestingly. So that's not that long a commitment. The other things that happened, there was the surprise US-China bilateral, and I must admit, in my mind, and that was generally received in a positive manner, but in my mind, I do wonder whether that's beginning to be a tacit recognition that trying to agree things in 197 country forum isn't going to be the way in which these decisions or key decisions are made going forward, and that the large emitting countries are basically going to drive the agenda going forward. The rule book, behind the scenes, there were lots and lots of discussions about the rule book, and that's all in the details, but it's really important. We don't hear much about it, but some form of agreement was reached on that. I think one of the most interesting arguments, though, is the bit about whose budget, and this is the carbon budget. So this is the budget that we've got remaining before we hit 1.5 or 2, however you choose to measure the target. But the key equity argument here is it can India's argument, for example, is that they should be entitled to use up that budget, not us, because we've been emitting and getting rich on emissions for decades while they haven't. And it has some force, that argument, but we will continue to see that argument being used. Next slide, please. We've heard a bit about the fossil fuel reference, and it is certainly a watershed because there has been no reference to fossil fuels in 26 years of trying. So it is a bit of a watershed. Whether it's a death knell, as Boris claimed, well, if we look at the first draft, we can see that it referred to, it said, to accelerate the phasing out of coal. That turned into, in the final text, that turned into accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power, which is quite a few more words and quite a few caveats to that, and also a considerable amount of context about dissemination of technology and support towards a just transition. But nonetheless, it's a watershed reference. Next slide, please. So how are these targets to be met? It's only a 10-page document, and some of us lawyers may want to take note on that. It's only 10 pages. And it therefore focuses on the outcomes or the targets. It's not a document that goes into detail about the how, which are largely left to the countries themselves. But there were lots of other papers and decisions reached at the conference. And I think there are a few themes emerging that is really worth understanding about the direction of travel. One of those, and the first of those, and the most important one, is that it's envisaged that markets will be used to drive change, not just government action and government intervention. Yes, government action is implied in the sense of subsidies, but basically it's the change will be driven through market mechanisms. And one of the most important ones of those will be the development of transparency and common reporting standards. And carbon reporting will become as commonplace as financial reporting. And that in turn will drive the creation of a new voluntary carbon market. So if you imagine, you hear a lot of companies and a lot of businesses at the moment talking about having targets for reducing their emissions. Imagine in 5 years' time, are those companies managing to achieve all of those emissions reductions? Probably not. And they'll be looking for other ways to do that. And one of the ways it will be investing in offsets. And that's essentially a project that sequesters carbon. Now, there's quite a bit of controversy around that because some people argue that it reduces the incentive to actually reduce emissions. But I think if we think what the overall objective here is, it's not just to reduce our emissions, it's to reduce them as quickly as we can, because we only have that remaining budget to use. And therefore, if we can reduce our net emissions more quickly by offsetting some of our emissions, then it makes sense to do that and to create a mechanism by which those sorts of projects can be financed. And that's what the aim is behind this voluntary carbon market. Creation of the hydrogen market. There needs to be a fuel that replaces the fossil fuels. At the moment, the choice looks like being a hydrogen, and hydrogen will become the vector of choice. But that implies the creation of an entirely new market that doesn't exist right now. And that will be established through subsidies, and that subsidy level will need to be sufficient to drive the substitution of fossil fuels, which will be highly dependent upon the fossil fuel price. Gas prices may stay high. I suspect they won't stay as high for the next 30 years. And we'll also see the creation of vast carbon storage facilities. The Climate Pact does acknowledge that emissions can be abated. Next slide. And so finally, just from me, what happens next? Well, there are only two ways to reduce our emissions. I mean, money is important, but really it's either we change behaviours, and it will be epoch defining if we are going to change them to reduce our emissions, which leaves only technology. And of course, that's the route that we're betting on. And the climate change strategy makes two bets. One, that we can develop new technologies to sustain our way of life and achieve net zero. And the second bet is that we can do that, and the cost of these new technologies can be reduced down to current levels. And basically, we did that with renewables. And the politicians have gotten onto that and essentially are hoping to repeat that for all the other technologies that are required to achieve net zero. All of which implies subsidy design. We need good subsidy structures to develop and foster the development and rollout of new technologies. And the UK has already started that path, and Isabella will talk a bit more about that. There'll be a race to develop the new technologies, and the onus is going to be on the developed countries to take the cost of the subsidies, develop the new technologies, and then make them affordable across the globe. It will be a sustained effort. I mean, this is not something we're going to do in 2 or 3 years, or even 10 years. This is a multi-decadal effort. The International Energy Association has estimated that the cost will be $4 trillion worth of energy investment every year in order to achieve these our goals. But what that means, of course, is that opportunity abounds. Expertise in energy technologies and infrastructure, some of which resides here in Scotland, which SJ will talk a bit more about, will be in high demand for decades. And now I'm going to hand on to Isabella, who's going to talk about the impact on the UK and UK policy in particular.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the implications that COP26 has on the energy transition. But first, I think it's important to set out what we mean by the energy transition. So what do we mean? We mean changing our energy system to one that's carbon neutral. And when we look at that at more of a granular level, what we really mean is decarbonising power, industry, heating and transport, as well as protecting our natural resources. Now, ultimately, that's going to end up meaning that there's a permanent change in supply, demand and price. Now, the legal bit that sits behind that is the Climate Change Act 2008. And the order that you see on the screen there amended that act to cement in law the UK government's target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Now, that's the foundation of it all, but what happened at COP26? Well, what was really interesting was that in the run-up to COP26, a lot of those in the political sphere started to make new pledges. And Boris Johnson's new pledge was to set a target of cutting emissions in the UK by 78% below 1990 levels by 2035. And he didn't stop there. He also followed Joe Biden's lead and committed the UK to achieving carbon-free electricity by 2035. So these will be really good indicators of whether we're on track to meet the net zero by 2050 target. But let's look at how these pledges might impact the energy transition. So if we move on, thank you. So let's look at low carbon heating first. So the issue is that emissions from heating buildings makes up 23% of all UK emissions. So that's a really significant number. So what's clear is that if we're going to meet this target of cutting emissions by 78% by 2035, then new heating appliances installed in homes and workplaces will need to be low carbon technologies. And when I'm talking about low carbon technologies, I'm thinking of air source heat pumps and hydrogen boilers, technologies like that. But the question is, how is that going to be achieved? And there's been quite a bit of debate around this, and it's been really interesting seeing how it's unfolded during COP and the weeks and months preceding that. Is how are we going to change that statistic? And I think my interpretation of it is that the UK government is definitely showing a preference for electrification of heat over hydrogen for heat. And the reason that I say that is because there's an immediacy about electrification of heat now. So you can get a £5,000 grant for an air source heat pump today if you really wanted to. Whereas the government has said that it's not making a decision on hydrogen until 2026. So it's definitely pushing its strategy on hydrogen into the future. Now, that doesn't mean that we write off hydrogen in heating completely. The government has published policy recently that says it's going to start running consultations and trials to see if there's any merit in investing in hydrogen boilers over the next few years and towards the end of the decade. But it's definitely a mid to long-term solution rather than short-term solution in comparison to electrification. I think it's safe to say, though, that there's no single solution to fixing those statistics, those heating statistics. It's going to be a mix of heat pumps, hydrogen, and heat networks. What's not clear is just exactly what those proportions of those different technologies are going to be. Okay, if we move on to low carbon transport. So as you'd imagine, hydrogen was a hot topic at COP26. If you didn't see it on the news, the UK government literally rolled in a hydrogen-powered train into Glasgow Central Station. They also demonstrated a hydrogen-powered ambulance. So two really good examples of green showcasing. And I think as more of a side note, we're going to see a lot more green showcasing. It's both in the private and the public sector, actually, because at the end of the day, it's good publicity to show a commitment to being green. It's good branding. But anyway, returning to hydrogen, UK policy is showing that hydrogen is more likely to be used as an energy vector in comparison to its use in industry. And when I'm talking about its use as an energy vector, I'm talking about it being used as a fuel to power trains, aeroplanes, buses, and things like that. Whereas when I'm talking about use in industry, I'm thinking use in oil refinery and steel production and things like that. So government policy is definitely showing that hydrogen is the best alternative to carbon intensive fuels in their mind, or at least that's where they're wanting to encourage investment. But I think the government is acutely aware that there's an infrastructure issue. A lot like the chicken and egg scenario that faced and is still facing the electric vehicle industry, there's an absence of infrastructure for hydrogen that makes it very difficult for end users to switch from a fossil fuel to a hydrogen fuel. So if we go on to the next slide and just have a look a little bit more in detail at the infrastructure challenge. So as I mentioned, there's no hydrogen transmission network at the moment. It's not like the gas network or the electricity transmission network. There's no easy way of getting hydrogen from A to B. Now, the good news is that there are trials being run to see if we can use decommissioned parts of the gas network for hydrogen in the future. But in the meantime, we're going to have to rely on private networks, and there is a risk there. The risk is an insolvency risk, which is associated with corporate off-takers, which is what you get when you've got hydrogen producers being connected with end users via a private network. And funders, investors don't like that. They want certainty of offtake before they invest their money into hydrogen projects. But the good news is the UK government has recognised that, and when you look at the policies that they published in the run-up to COP, they certainly have the intention of allocating funding to minimise this insolvency risk in order to encourage funders, investors to invest in this new technology. And I've put a couple of examples on the slide there of the types of funding that we might see. So the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund and the Revenue Support Scheme, which will look a lot like the Renewable Electricity CFD scheme. So to conclude on hydrogen, it's definitely going to take a key role in decarbonising transport. There's just some barriers that need to be overcome, which the government is working on trying to resolve. So if we move on to the next slide, let's have a look at the outlook for oil and gas. So there's two graphs on your screen there. On the left, we have a graph showing liquid fuel consumption, what it's predicted to be over the next 30 years or so. And on the right, the same for gas consumption. Now, the line that I'm interested in on those two graphs is the blue one. The blue one shows it demonstrates a net zero by 2050 scenario. So that's the one that we're interested in looking at. So if we look at oil consumption, the expectation is that over the next 30 years or so, the consumption is going to decline. I think the main reason for that is probably that investment in carbon neutral technologies is likely to surpass investment in oil projects, because low carbon alternatives are starting to look quite attractive and viable now that the government is subsidizing them or is going to subsidize them. But that's it's not necessarily a bad thing for oil companies, because this energy transition isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to be a slow transition over the next 30 to 50 years. And what that means is that the revenue that's coming from oil at the moment, that isn't going to disappear overnight, there's an opportunity there for that money to be reinvested into low carbon technologies, carbon neutral technologies, so that ultimately oil companies can become carbon neutral. Now, if we look at gas on the right, you'll see that the picture is slightly different. Again, if we look at the blue line, the expectation is that over the next 5 years, gas consumption is going to increase before slowly tailing off and plateauing towards 2050. And I think there's multiple reasons why our expectations of gas are different to oil in terms of demand. And one of those is that it's an obvious alternative to coal, and that's because it's low carbon in comparison. So as coal leaves the energy picture, gas is going to, at least in part, fill its shoes. Another reason is that it's a feedstock for blue hydrogen. And of course, in blue hydrogen, the carbon is captured and stored, which makes it a near net zero carbon technology. So there's a future for it in that respect as well. And then finally, I think it's worth mentioning it's the role it plays in terms of seasonal balancing, because gas doesn't have the trouble that renewable electricity has, renewable generation has, in that if it's not windy or it's not sunny, we face intermittency problems in the renewable arena, whereas we don't with gas. So it plays a really good offsetting role. So I think to conclude on this section of the webinar, I think it's safe to say that nothing is going to change overnight as a result of COP26. But we're definitely going to see significant changes in the energy mix over the next 50 years. And I think Sarah-Jane is going to touch on those a bit more in the context of Scotland. So Sarah-Jane, if I can hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Isabella. So as Isabella and Keith have said, I'm going to offer some reflections on what COP26 means for Scotland, because we've heard quite a bit already about what it means for the globe and for the UK. Let's start with a quick reminder of Scotland's key targets, which are slightly different to the UK ones. We have committed to achieve net zero by 2045, which is 5 years earlier than the UK as a whole. And we've also committed to an interim target of 75% reduction by 2030. And if you compare that to the target that Isabella just mentioned, which the UK signed up to at COP26, committed to reducing by 78% by 2035. So you can see that Scotland needs to go further and faster than the UK as a whole to achieve these targets. And the Committee on Climate Change have pointed out that the 2030 target in particular is incredibly challenging. It goes beyond the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change, and it's more than they thought possible. And the key concern for them is how is Scotland going to be able to stride ahead of the UK on some of these key transitions that need to take place, such as decarbonising homes and decarbonising industry. Of course, that doesn't mean that Scotland can't achieve these targets. Scotland has done very well to date, but the scale of the challenge shouldn't be underestimated. In response to these comments, the Scottish Government referred to their climate change plan, saying that it sets out a clear and credible pathway to the 2030 targets. And there is a lot of good stuff in the plan, albeit it's obviously much easier to write it than to implement it. But I wonder whether, particularly reflecting on COP26, a better response to being accused of setting too ambitious a target might have been to say that it's better to be ambitious and to miss it than to be conservative and meet it. However, the CCC's official report to the Scottish Parliament on Scotland's progress is due imminently, so we'll see how on track or not Scotland is in the next month or so. So let's look next at what the problem is. And in terms of affecting our ability to meet these targets, the first problem is devolution. And that was apparent at COP26 as well, where it's the UK that's the member that's there and Scotland is hosting, but not really there. The first problem is devolution. A lot of the policy levers that could be used to deliver the Scottish targets are reserved to Westminster. This includes most of our energy policy, and energy is absolutely key to the transition. It also includes most taxation, which would include carbon taxes, and the ability to raise revenues to fund new low carbon subsidy regimes. The second problem is that a lot of the renewable technologies that are predominantly based in Scotland need to access UK support. And in particular, I wanted to highlight a couple of examples. Firstly, marine renewables, particularly tidal. We're making loads of good progress at an R&D and demonstration level in Scotland, but it needs access to the CFD, the UK CFD, to fully commercialise. Also, I wanted to highlight pump storage hydro, because there's loads of potential for that in Scotland, and there are schemes in development, some consented, but the investment case relies upon a support mechanism or a long-term grid services market, which just isn't available quite yet. And the third problem, well, the first two CCS clusters are going to be established in the north of England. We could spend some time discussing the politics of that decision, but it's clear that CCS clusters are absolutely clear to decarbonising industry, and we need to do that in Scotland too. So Scotland is going to need to catch up, and we'll want to ensure that the Scottish CCS cluster can still move forward quickly. So what can Scotland do? Well, we can play to our strengths. Consider the power of the mixed selfie. Scotland did not have a seat at COP26 because we're not a UN member, but Nicola Sturgeon did a pretty good job of grabbing as much publicity as possible with all of our celebrity selfies. And whether you agree or not with her politics, getting visibility for Scotland during COP26 was an important objective. And we can also show leadership. Scotland is small, but it is relatively wealthy in a global measure, and it's achieved a lot already. So I wanted to spend a bit of time looking at some of these strengths, and I will apologise that I will go slightly off-piste from energy, but just because I think when we look at net zero, we have to consider a bit of the bigger picture too. So we have onshore wind, we've always had loads of it, and we've had a relatively supportive policy environment. So there'll be much more of this to come, possibly even without UK support mechanisms, given the relative low cost of onshore wind. Then we have floating offshore wind. We may have been a bit behind the curve on the fixed bottom offshore wind, which works better in shallow water. But in floating wind, we can really demonstrate strength in our expertise of hostile offshore environments and therefore access potentially huge resource in Scottish waters. On carbon storage, well, the first CCS clusters may have been awarded in England, but it's still all to play for here. We have capacity in the North Sea that may be attractive to the UK and indeed to other European nations, particularly in industrial heartlands where they may become expert in capturing carbon, but will then need somewhere to put it. We also need to think about renewable grid balancing at scale, as Isabella's mentioned. As our grid becomes more full of intermittent renewables, we need more balancing plant. And of course, batteries and gas will play a part in that, but large scale pump storage is a really important part of the mix too, and we know how to deliver that in Scotland. And for some time to come, our net zero carbon power system is going to need gas plants with CCS. However, key to this is going to be the ability to extract and produce the input gas fuel in a carbon neutral way. And finally, skills and expertise. In Scotland, we've been exporting innovation and skills for centuries, and we can absolutely do more of that with the transition to net zero, particularly when Scotland has achieved so much already in low carbon power. But, well, it's still only 9 years to 2030. We're going to have to move very quickly. That 2030 target likely assumes a CCS cluster being delivered in Scotland and the first ScotWind projects. That implies also that we need to ensure that our consenting regimes are favourable and efficient, which is also within our gift. So looking at what else we can do, well, we can also invest in solutions. That's a key theme through the Scottish Programme for Government that was published in September. It focuses much more on investment than on regulation in the context of becoming a net zero nation. I've picked out just a few highlights on the slide, looking at that big number, 1.8 billion to decarbonise homes. Lots of investment is required there. There's lots of investment set aside for public transport, including buses, and active travel is a big focus, with committing 10% of the annual transport budget on active travel, including free bikes for school-aged children. I think that might be a bit of a vote winner. 500 million planned as well for the natural economy, and I think that's the sort of off-piste section that I was talking about. A big focus in the programme for government and on what Scotland can do is around nature. And we can't forget that the net zero target relies upon the natural sequestration of carbon that we can't avoid emitting, as Keith's already said. And in fact, Scottish Government state that nature-based solutions will contribute around 30% of the emissions reduction that we need. The Committee on Climate Change has also recognised that Scotland has much more natural capacity for that carbon storage, and we may be a net contributor to the UK as a whole on that measure. There's also lots and lots and lots of plans, and we've seen a few of those published already. Again, I've highlighted a couple only. There will be a just transition plan promised for each sector of the economy, with oil and gas identified as a hotspot area, with a focus on harnessing and enhancing skills to enable workers to access new opportunities. And that just transition plan for the oil and gas sector is to be published alongside a refreshed energy strategy. There's also plans to deliver 3 carbon neutral islands by 2040 ahead of the 2045 target, although no hints yet on which ones those might be. And we've seen the promised heat network delivery plan delivered this week. And of course, plans and planning are important, and at the very least they provide that clear policy guidance that investors need to invest, but implementation is the measure by which these plans will be tested, so action to implement them is going to be needed swiftly. So what else can Scotland do in terms of regulation? Because I have mentioned that devolution is a problem, but Scotland does have a reasonable set of devolved powers that can help deliver the targets that it has committed to. In particular on heat, which is a really challenging sector for decarbonisation, the Scottish Government does have quite a large amount of scope. It can regulate heat networks, which it has already started to do through passing the Heat Networks Act, and it also controls building standards and energy efficiency rules. There's also a lot the Scottish Government can do on transport. It's promised free bus travel for young people to encourage better use of public transport, and they have an overall target to reduce car miles by 20% by 2030, using quite a range of measures. On the railways too, ScotRail will be nationalised from March 2022, and so Scottish Government is going to have a lot of control there, and have promised £5 billion over the Parliament for more electrification, and where electrification isn't appropriate, looking at hydrogen-powered trains. Again, Isabella mentioned rolling the hydrogen-powered train into Central Station. And on the environment, Scotland has powers to regulate environmental measures. We have a devolved regulator in SEPA. So a natural environment bill has been promised for year 3 of the Parliament, and also a plan to designate at least one new national park by the end of the Parliament. And there you can see the influence of having the Scottish Greens in government, because that was a Scottish Greens commitment. No decision yet on where the new national park might be, although I understand that campaigns have been mounted to promote potential park in Galloway and in the Borders. So watch that space. So just in conclusion, what does it all mean for Scotland? Scotland does have very challenging targets. They're not recorded as a result of COP26, but they were there to start with. But those targets are more challenging than the other UK nations. So we're going to have to move quickly, and we're going to have to move faster. Achieving the targets will require access to new UK policy support and lots of collaboration with the UK government. This makes our timetable a bit less certain, and 2030 really isn't far away. I think it's key that Scotland should recognise and play to its strengths in terms of resources, skills, expertise, and positive policy where that's possible. We need to invest in the key sectors that will make a significant contribution to our net zero targets, but also in innovation generally. As Keith mentioned earlier, the big bets on technology solutions that are going to be able to achieve net zero while maintaining our way of life. We can't forget about, and we must harness our natural resources and recognise the service that they provide. And we should continue to export our skills and expertise, as indeed we have done in the past. And if we do all of that, then I think the net zero transition can be really positive for Scotland, and we can deliver beyond the COP26 consensus and show some real leadership. Essentially, it's all to play for. And on that, as a hopefully positive conclusion to our discussion, I'll hand back to Sonia for some questions.
Thank you very much. That was very informative from the 3 speakers. So I've picked up a few questions from the Q&A function. So I'm just going to dive right in, given that we have limited time left. So the first question, does the agreement reached in Glasgow place more emphasis on avoiding carbon emissions, or is the strategy to continue emitting carbon and focus on carbon capture instead? I wonder, Keith, could you maybe pick this one up as a start? Thanks.
Sure, Sonia. It's a good question, and it's a question that will continue to be asked for quite a few years yet, I think. As I mentioned, the agreement itself doesn't direct how countries should achieve net zero and how they should get to that point. But it does recognise that, for example, it references unabated coal. So it does recognise that emissions will continue and those should be abated. And there's been a huge body of work going into the creation of a voluntary carbon market, which implies offsets. And as I mentioned, I think the conclusion at the moment is that both are required if we are going to achieve net zero. Yes, ultimately we will want to get to a position where we don't have carbon emitting technologies used at all, but we're not going to do that by 2050. 2070 if we're lucky, and therefore there's going to have to be abatement, and there's going to have to be offset projects in order for us to avoid, in order for us to try and meet a 1.5 or even a below 2 target.
Okay. Great, that's really interesting. Yeah, very interesting as well when you were speaking about in terms of the amendments that you'd highlighted in the grey, in terms of those kind of caveats that were inserted. That was quite enlightening.
Yes, I mean, and that's the traditional diplomatic process of negotiating international agreements. But I think the overall framework is clearly that we need to be able to do both. We cannot deliver net zero, or we cannot deliver gross zero, shall we say, by 2050. At least not without, as I called it, epoch-defining behavioural change. So the carbon offsets and abatements are crucial technologies. They may turn out to be just transitional technologies, but they are going to be crucial to achieving these objectives.
Great. Okay, thanks, Keith. Okay, another question that we have in this time, I wonder, Sarah-Jane, if I can ask you, to what extent is investment in innovation key to achieving climate change goals? So that's quite interesting because you've already mentioned that. So to what extent is that actually key?
I think innovation is absolutely key, but I'm also really confident that we can do that. And I think COP26 aside for a second, the last 18 months have really demonstrated what we can do when we challenge people to come up with solutions to an imminent threat and then fund their efforts appropriately. So that gives me a lot of hope that we can do that with climate change as well. And I mean, one of the things I love most about the job I do is getting to work every day with clients who are coming up with amazing new ideas to deliver carbon neutral heat and power, and look at the progress that's been made so far to decarbonise electricity through the efforts of people like that. So I think provided we can persuade Treasury to part with a bit more cash, then I think we continue to make significant progress on the innovation side.
Can I maybe just jump in? And that SJ is very optimistic as ever, and I would agree that there's no doubt that we will develop these technologies. But the doubt that exists in my mind is whether we'll do it. And whether we'll be able to reduce the cost of energy from new technologies down to the current levels of energy. The one thing I have positive in my mind in that regard is that the price of oil, at least, has been based on the cartel over the years, cartel. So higher than just the cost of production, but coal hasn't been. And so can we get to the point where we can have alternatives to coal power that are as cheap as coal power? I think it's still a big question mark. It may be that populations over time, if the price rise is very gradual, will not notice it, and that will or that the cost of fuels will reduce because they are related to the cost of production rather than the cartel pricing, and that may offset that. But there's still a question mark over that bit of it.
Yeah, noted. Okay, very good. Right, let me just pick another question. Keith, I think this might be one for you again. Quite a thorny question. Can our climate change goals be achieved without a carbon tax?
There's been lots of discussion over the past decade over, do we use the stick of a carbon tax, or do we use carrots of subsidies and so on? For many years, all the experts said carbon tax was essential, and indeed we do have some carbon taxes for the heavy, high-emitting industries, and there are plans to extend that. But the carbon tax and carbon price in different countries has been very different. So, in the EU, it might be, $40. In Sweden, it might be above 100. In Australia, it might be close to zero. But what has definitely happened over the last few years is that the impetus towards that has reduced, because voting populations have rebelled and politicians seeking votes have followed suit. So the emphasis now is very much on the subsidy side of it and incentivising private market action. So that is for now the emphasis. Time will tell whether in 10 years' time we think that that's sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
So watch this space.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens to the level of subsidies over time as well, compared to what's actually needed. Yeah, okay, I think we probably have time for one more question. I wonder, Isabella, can I ask you what, or maybe actually yourself or Sarah-Jane, what UK support will be required for Scotland to meet its emissions targets? So, because we discussed that earlier about the fact that UK support would be required, we'd have to work alongside the UK in terms of getting to our 2045 goal.
Sarah-Jane, I'll let you take that one first.
Yeah, so I think it's necessary, because the technologies that we've identified as part of the energy transition require the UK support mechanisms that are already in place, and they need to be able to access that to get to the low cost of energy that Keith was talking about. I think also just the nature of the devolved reserved arrangement that we have in the UK, there has to be cross-government collaboration, because it would be disastrous if there was a very different policy objective taken in other parts of the UK than in Scotland, that meant that we went on a completely different road. It's not, it doesn't really make much sense. So I think it has to be joined up and collaborative, and certainly the support mechanisms that are there at the moment are absolutely essential to driving forward our reduced cost of the transition.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think Scotland's really well placed, though, to be instrumental in the energy transition. It's the benefit it has of natural resources, its geography. It means it's really well placed to be a central player in the whole of the UK transition. And I feel like I'm allowed to say that because I'm English and I've moved to Scotland, so I feel like I've got the whole picture.
Good. That's well. It's a great note to end on. So, thank you all. That brings today's session to a close. So, thank you to all of our speakers, and also to all of you for joining us today. We hope you found this webinar useful. It would be really helpful if you could help us by taking the short feedback survey at the end of this. It will pop up automatically at the end of the webinar, and we would just really appreciate it if you could just take a very short amount of time to answer the 5 questions, and it just helps to shape our future events and webinars. Excuse me. If you can also keep an eye out on our website, brodies.com, you will see details for our next Energy Academy series along with other events. So in the meantime, everyone, thank you again and goodbye for now.